Melissa, we're talking right now in regards to relocation, and I know you also had another topic as well.
So relocation and clients who are moving simultaneous are pretty hot topics right now because we do see that people are moving more regularly as part of the culture that we have now. Mm-hmm. You don't see families stay in the same home for 30, 40 years, which is what's happened generationally before us.
Yep.
So routinely, if I have a client who's selling a home, they want to simultaneously purchase so that they are not displaced for any amount of time and they're able to close at the same time. And that just presents some logistical constraints. Certainly, you have to make sure that all mortgage parties are involved. I've been involved in transactions where there's 3 or 4 transactions stacked up. So buyer 1 has to close before the seller can sell their home and buy their second transaction. And then there may even be additional domino transactions after that. So it just becomes a lot more difficult to coordinate the movers, to coordinate the financing constraints, to make sure that the monies are being transferred. We routinely will reach out to other closing attorneys who are involved in the transactions before us to have the funds wired so that the consumers can use those monies same day, which, again, even if they're coming in from out of state or across the country, we have the ability to do because wires are real time. And with the technology today, it's a lot more helpful. Mm-hmm. So relocation transactions, not much different than the simultaneous closings because there are a lot of moving pieces that need to be considered. And I think what we've primarily focused on the show today is relocation for folks who are retiring and want to head down south. But I also do a fair number of transactions, as I'm sure you folks do, where clients are relocating into Rhode Island or out of Rhode Island through a relocation company because they have a corporate gig here and they have been relocated, be it CVS or G-Tech or something of that nature. And those relocation transactions have certain variables that require due attention to make sure that they're getting reimbursements for certain items that the relo company is supposed to pick up, including moving expenses. Again, you see people who are coming in sometimes before their possessions. So there's some variables as to when their closing date is going to be. We have to coordinate it around their travel schedules. So we can't just move the closing 2 and 3 times like you do in regular transactions. You have to be a lot more mindful of those time constraints.
Yeah, or else they'll be living in a motel.
Yes, and that does happen. And they don't like that.
No, I wouldn't either.
Well, it's expensive and it's difficult, especially if you have families with young children, to have to live in a hotel for any amount of time. It's difficult, right, TJ? You know you've got kids.
Yeah, it would be impossible.
Yeah.
It would border on impossible. And what else happens even if one of those 4, when you're talking about the domino of transactions, if one gets delayed, often they're all delayed. And that causes a lot of difficult conversations sometimes, especially I had a situation this year where the movers were booked and it was because colleges were coming back.
Yep.
And if you didn't book your mover like the first week of September or the second week of August, rather, you were going to be out of luck. And it causes a whole level of panic for a lot of people. And there are a lot of variables, a lot of different people. It could be lawyer. Everybody has a lawyer. Everybody has an agent. Everyone has a mortgage broker. That's a lot of people.
52 people per transaction on average. 52 people.
Wow.
There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of people in there. And Melissa, I think that we were on a transaction. This was probably about a year ago or so. And there was, I'm not sure, I believe it was you. And it ended up working out well. But we had 5, like you said, we had 5 transactions that were all dependent on one another. And the first transaction out of 5, I had the listing on the 5th. The first transaction out of all 5 fell through.
Yeah.
And everybody was like, oh, man, panicking. But every single realtor worked together on this. I've never seen realtors work so well together. And this is what we do. We worked so well together, and we figured it out. And we actually came up with a renter for that first one because the person didn't have to sell. They could have rented it, and that's how we got it done.
Oh, that's nice to hear that there was a collection of efforts because so often in this industry it gets cutthroat, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, but you know what? It does, but there's so many great professionals out there that are now seeing, the difference and working together is like, that's what it's all about. And there's a growing number of mindful agents out there really looking out for the consumer.
Yeah. And speaking of the consumer, what about the folks who have already relocated? So, TJ, you had posed a question earlier in the segment where The woman was planning to move to Florida first and then sell her house. So now you have to consider a client who's already gone. Are they coming back in order to clear out the property, in order to actually sign on the dotted line, as you will, in order to complete the sale? Oftentimes, those clients don't have the additional resources for the flights back and forth, or frankly, just don't want to deal with it because they're in new jobs, unless they've relocated for retirement purposes. So you have to be mindful of getting those consumers protected with legal representation so that they can be represented while they're out of state in anticipation of this sale. Because as we talked about, you've got potential non-resident withholding tax implications, potential capital gain liability that they need to be mindful of depending on when they've relocated.
It's almost mandatory if you're relocating and I'm representing a seller who moved out of state that they have their own counsel.